Hey adventurer, welcome back to The Weary Wanderer. Tonight, we're pulling back the brightly painted curtain on a history that's anything but romantic. We're here to explore exactly why life absolutely, unequivocally sucked for the Romani people, the so-called Gypsies, as they navigated the treacherous landscape of 15th to 17th century Europe, where the welcome mat was usually a pitchfork. You've seen the romantic paintings, heard the lilting songs, perhaps even read the breathless stories, the mysterious gypsy, eyes full of ancient secrets, wagging a vibrant splash against a bucolic landscape, forever free and dancing just beyond the reach of mundane lives. But let me tell you, being a Romani traveler in the 15th to 17th century Europe, a Rom in a world that decided your very breath was an affront, was nothing like a fairy tale. It was a relentless, bone-grinding, heart-squeezing existence. And for most who lived it, it profoundly, fundamentally sucked. The only ancient secrets they were privy to were how to stitch a wound with a horsehair which berries wouldn't kill you, and how to disappear before the torches arrived. If you appreciate stories that don't shy away from the gristle of history, and if you reckon that understanding the past means looking at the misery as much as the majesty, then please do take a moment to like this video and subscribe to The Weary Wanderer. Let me know in the comments if you've ever encountered the sanitized storybook version of the Gypsy, because we're about to muddy those clear waters considerably. Now perhaps find a comfortable spot, a true luxury our Romani rarely, if ever, knew, unless it was a patch of suspicious-smelling straw in a barn they weren't technically supposed to be in. Close your eyes for a moment, if you will, and prepare to rattle down a road paved with prejudice and persecution with us, because you weren't so much born to motion as you were born to run. You weren't so much born as you were jolted into existence by the first rut in a forgotten track, the scent of wood smoke and damp earth your first lullaby. There was no ancestral home of stone and mortar awaiting you, no neatly plowed fields promising a predictable future. Your inheritance was the wagon itself, perhaps painted with faded symbols of luck and warding, its timbers groaning like an old man with every mile, a testament to your grandfather's hands. The sky was your only reliable ceiling, the earth your cradle, your map, and your constant, often brutal warning. They called you Gypsy, a misnomer clinging to you like burrs, though your people's memory stretched back to lands far from Egypt. You were funneled into the lineage of the Rom, a river of travelers flowing through a hostile landscape. No silver spoons, no soft beds, just the family's battered kettle, a legacy of nimble fingers and sharp wits, and the ever-present acrid scent of suspicion practically woven into your swaddling cloth, a perfume that announced your arrival long before your wagon wheels were heard. From the moment you could toddle without immediately impaling yourself on a tent peg or wandering into a blacksmith's fire, you were put to work. Forget learning your letters. Your alphabet was the language of horses, a twitch of an ear, a stamp of a hoof. By age 5, you weren't playing with carved toys. You were cheap, expendable labor, your small hands perfect for polishing trinkets or fetching water that was likely cleaner than the welcome you'd receive. Your toys? Perhaps a discarded horseshoe, a smooth river stone, or the intricate patterns of frost on a winter morning. Things that cost nothing and could be left behind without a second thought. Your playground. The dusty verges of unwelcoming roads, the shadowy fringes of forests where you'd make camp, or the bustling, dangerous chaos of a market square where you learned to read faces faster than any scholar read a book. While other children were presumably doing whatever it is children with roofs over their heads did, probably something involving less dysentery and more regular meals, you were mastering the grim but vital skills of your people. How to charm a suspicious dog, how to tell a genuine coin from a counterfeit by its ring, how to gauge the mood of a village by the way the smoke curled from its chimneys. Fun games included, spot the constable before he spots you. How many languages can you beg for bread in? and the ever-popular, "Let's not get blamed for the missing chickens this time." Your primary instructor in this open-air school of hard knocks was likely your father, or perhaps an uncle, a man whose face was a roadmap of every bad road and bitter winter he'd ever survived, etched with lines of worry and weariness. His vocabulary was as sparse as a winter stew, consisting mainly of grunts, sharp commands, and the occasional, surprisingly tender folk song hummed under his breath when he thought no one was listening. He taught you everything not through patient explanation, but through harsh example and the immediate, painful consequences of your mistakes. A poorly mended pot meant no supper. A spooked horse meant a kick, or worse, the loss of a valuable asset. Kindness was a luxury rarely afforded, but pragmatism was served up daily. He might cuff you for clumsiness one moment and share his last crust of bread with you the next, his eyes holding a flicker of something that might have been pride, or perhaps just the grim recognition of another soul condemned to the same relentless journey. The world rarely greeted you with a gentle nudge. More often, it was the damp, bone-aching chill seeping through the thin canvas of the Vardo, your family's creaking painted wagon home, that wrestled you from sleep. Long before the sun even thought about bothering the horizon, you'd be stirring, not to the smell of baking bread, but to the acrid scent of last night's dwindling fire and the ever-present, earthy aroma of horse. Your first conscious sensation was often the rough rub of the straw-filled palate against your skin, already sticky with the night's sweat and the grime of countless roads. This layer of dirt, a second skin really, was less a choice and more an occupational hazard, a gritty testament to a life lived in constant motion and rarely in the vicinity of a proper bath. Then, the sounds would begin to filter in, each one a potential omen. The soft stamp and snort of the horses, tethered nearby, their breath pluming in the cold air. Were they restless? Had they scented something amiss? And then, inevitably, the distant, metallic clang of church bells. For the settled folk, the gaje, this was a call to prayer, a marker of their ordered lives. For your people, it was more often a warning. The village is stirring, its routines beginning, its suspicions already awake and looking for a target. Each peal felt less like a benediction and more like a countdown timer on your unwelcome presence. Your father would already be alert, a still silhouette against the pale gray light, his head tilted, listening. Not just listening to the sounds you could hear, but to the silences in between, to the way the wind carried the scent of wood smoke, theirs or someone else's. He was a scholar of unseen dangers, his textbook the rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the sudden flight of birds. His quiet guttural words to your mother would set the tone for the day. We move before the sun is fully up, or, if luck was with you, we can risk a small fire for a warm drink. A warm drink, luxury. More often, breakfast was a hurried, anxious affair. A hunk of dark, dense bread, perhaps studded with seeds that crunched like tiny pebbles, would be torn and shared, its taste a familiar blend of sourness and the faint metallic tang of the knife that cut it. You'd gnaw on it slowly, making it last, washing it down with a gulp of water from the goatskin bag, water that always tasted faintly of leather, and the memory of the last stream you dared to fill it from. Every mouthful was taken with an ear cocked, every swallow accompanied by the silent prayer that today wouldn't be the day the local constable decided to earn his keep by harassing the gypsies. As the light grew, so did the activity, a carefully choreographed dance of packing and preparing. The younger children, still bleary-eyed, would be shushed and bundled, their small complaints absorbed by the general air of urgency. Bedding would be rolled, pots and pans secured so they wouldn't rattle an alarm to the whole countryside, the horses checked and harnessed. Every movement was economical, born of long practice. There was no room for wasted effort, no time for leisurely departures. The goal was to be a whisper, a rumor, a fading track in the dew-laden grass, by the time the first villager stumbled out to greet the day. If the family were tinsmiths or horse traders, the men and older boys would then face the delicate, dangerous task of approaching a settlement. They wouldn't swagger in, they'd drift towards the outskirts, their tools their only passport, their eyes constantly scanning for the mood of the place. The reek of the village midden, the sharp smell of wood smoke from chimneys, the distant shouts of children. These were the signs they navigated. Pots to mend, good sirs, knives to sharpen, a horse that needs a gentle hand. Their voices would be carefully neutral, betraying neither fear nor arrogance. The sun, climbing higher, would often feel less like a source of warmth and more like a spotlight, pinning them in their otherness. The sting of sweat in their eyes, the grit of dust coating their throats, the ache in their shoulders from carrying their heavy tool bags. These were the small, constant miseries that framed the larger anxieties of the day. Each transaction was a gamble. A few coins, grudgingly given, meant food. A slammed door, a shouted insult, the sudden appearance of a man with a cudgel that meant a hasty retreat, hunger, and the bitter taste of injustice. For the women and younger children who remained with the wagons, hidden perhaps in a copse of trees or a forgotten hollow, the day was a different kind of toil. Foraging was a constant necessity. Eyes sharp for the glint of edible berries in a thorny thicket, hands quick to dig for roots, ears always alert for the sound of approaching footsteps. The sharp, sweet scent of wild garlic, the earthy smell of mushrooms, carefully chosen for a mistake could be fatal. The bitter tang of certain leaves, these were the smells of their pantry. Mending was an endless task, fingers growing raw as they pushed a needle through coarse, patched fabric. The wind, if it was up, wouldn't be a playful breeze. It would be a nagging, persistent thief, tugging at the wagon covers, chilling them through their thin clothes, and carrying the frustrating scent of baking bread from a village they couldn't enter. And if they dared to light a small fire for a meager midday meal, the smoke itself was a risk, a signal that could draw unwanted attention. The constant low-level hum of anxiety was as much a part of their atmosphere as the air they breathed. Sometimes there was fortune-telling. A woman from the village, curious or desperate, might seek them out. Then, your mother or an aunt would transform. Her voice, usually quiet and practical, would take on a musical, mysterious cadence. She'd read the lines on a calloused palm, her own hands, rough from work, surprisingly gentle. She'd speak of journeys and lovers, of hidden treasures and warnings, her eyes holding the client's, gauging belief, searching for the glint of a coin. It was a performance, a delicate art of selling hope and mystique, all while acutely aware that the same person who sought her wisdom could, in the next breath, denounce her as a witch. The air would be thick with the scent of the herbs she carried, a faint, sweet smell that mingled with the underlying tension. As evening approached, the anxiety often sharpened. Finding a safe place to camp for the night was paramount. Not too close to the village, lest they be discovered and chased off, or worse, not too far if they hoped for any trade the next day. The ideal spot was invisible, defensible, and preferably near water that wasn't actively poisonous. The sounds of dusk, the chirping of crickets, the hoot of an owl, were rarely comforting. They were the sounds of a world indifferent to your plight, a world where you were always an outsider. Supper, if the day had yielded anything, would be cooked over a small, carefully shielded fire, the smell of wood smoke, a beacon of both comfort and danger. A thin stew, perhaps, flavored with foraged herbs, eaten in hurried silence or with hushed conversation in Romani, the language a small, warm circle in the vast, cold darkness. And sleep? Sleep was rarely a peaceful oblivion. It was a shallow, restless state, punctuated by the creak of the wagon, the sigh of the wind, the distant bark of a dog that could mean anything or nothing. You'd lie there, feeling the hard boards through the thin bedding, the lingering itch of insect bites from the day, the dull ache of muscles weary from walking or working. The night wasn't a time for dreams. It was a time for listening, for waiting, for the whole exhausting, uncertain cycle to begin again, with the first unwelcome hint of dawn. This wasn't just a day in the life. It was life itself, a relentless grind against a world that wished you gone. The Romani travelers' relationship with their tools was a complicated affair, a marriage of grim necessity and frequent bitter frustration. These weren't gleaming instruments of a celebrated artisan, lovingly maintained in a well-stocked workshop. These were the battered, often scavenged, and perpetually failing implements of survival, each one carrying its own story of hardship and making do, each one imbued with a personality as cantankerous and unreliable as a drunken magistrate. Pride of place, of course, went to the Vardo, the horse-drawn wagon that served as home, transport, and a rolling symbol of their otherness. If you imagine a quaint, brightly painted caravan from a storybook, you're only getting half the picture, and likely the half that's been varnished by romantic fiction. Yes, they were often adorned with carvings, perhaps passed down through generations, symbols of luck, family, and a forgotten history. Their colors sometimes surprisingly vibrant against the drabness of the road. But beneath the paint and the mystique, these were often rickety contraptions, groaning under the strain of constant travel over unforgiving terrain like an old man with a terminal cough. An axle, poorly greased because who could spare the fat, and likely sourced from 3 different long-dead wagons, might choose the middle of a hostile village square, precisely when the market was at its busiest, and the local watch was feeling particularly officious, to finally give up the ghost with a sickening crack. The sound alone, a sharp wooden scream followed by a lurch that sent pots, children, and meager belongings flying in a chaotic explosion of your private life onto the public stage, was enough to make your heart plummet into your worn-out boots. Then came the desperate, hurried repairs, a frantic ballet of improvisation often undertaken in darkness or pouring rain, with inadequate tools, a bent piece of iron for a lever, a stone for a hammer, and the constant cold dread of discovery. A broken wheel wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a public declaration of vulnerability, immobilizing you, making you a sitting duck for whatever malice the local population or authorities might cook up, from jeers and thrown refuse to outright arrest for vagrancy, because your house had just collapsed. The canvas roof, a patchwork quilt of repairs held together by hope and tar that always smelled faintly of yesterday's rain and despair, would inevitably develop new leaks with every significant downpour. These weren't quaint little drips. These were insidious streams that transformed your cramped living space into a sodden, miserable cave. The drip, 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 a maddening soundtrack to your discomfort. The pervasive smell of damp wool, mildew, and unwashed bodies a permanent fixture. This wasn't a charming mobile home. It was a fragile, drafty, and often treacherous shell against a hostile world, a constant source of anxiety as much as a place of refuge. Its every creak and groan a reminder of its potential to betray you at the worst possible moment. And the horses, the horses. They were more than tools. They were partners, 4-legged family members, companions in misery. Their warm breath on a cold morning, a small comfort. Their strength, the literal engine of your survival. A Romani family's wealth and well-being were often measured by the health and number of their horses, scrawny, overworked beasts though they often were. They were treated with a mixture of deep affection, born of shared suffering, and brutal pragmatism. Fed before the family sometimes, because a lame or sick horse meant catastrophe on a scale that made mere hunger pale. But what could you feed them when you could barely feed yourselves? Grazing on the verges of roads, often sparse and poor, or snatched mouthfuls from a farmer's field under cover of darkness, an act of desperate theft that could get you whipped or branded, was rarely enough. The sight of a horse's ribs showing through its hide, like the bars of a cage you were all trapped in, was a constant gnawing worry. And just like the wagon, they were vulnerable, seemingly conspiring against you. A stone picked up on a rough track, no bigger than a pigeon's egg, could lead to a crippling lameness that no poultice of hoarded herbs could cure. Disease, swift and unforgiving, could sweep through your small herd, leaving you stranded and destitute. And of course, they were a prime target for thieves, both the opportunistic kind and the officially sanctioned kind, where confiscation by authorities on the flimsiest of pretexts was just legalized robbery. Losing a horse wasn't like losing an inanimate object. It was like losing a limb, a part of your ability to flee, to earn, to simply exist. The quiet nicker of a horse in the pre-dawn gloom, the familiar, comforting smell of their sweat and worn leather harness. These were the intimate details of a life lived in precarious symbiosis. This bond, forged in shared hardship and mutual dependence, was always shadowed by the fear of their and your own fragility, and the bitter resentment that such loyal creatures had to share your cursed fate. Then came the specific tools of whatever trade your family plied, each with its own malevolent streak. If they were tinsmiths, it was the hammers, the anvils, often small portable ones that threatened to bounce away with every strike, the shears that chewed more than cut, the soldering irons that heated unevenly. These were not the fine, specialized instruments of a guild craftsman. More likely, they were a motley collection, some inherited and worn smooth as river stones, some traded for in moments of desperate need, some perhaps even fashioned by hand from scavenged metal. A hammer handle, polished by generations of use, might be cracked and bound with fraying leather strips that bit into your palm. Shears, sharpened on a handy rock until their edges were more serrated than straight, might require immense effort to cut through a sheet of metal, the screeching sound and auditory assault that set your teeth on edge and announced your presence to anyone within earshot who might be looking for trouble. The solder, if you could get good tin, a luxury, might run true, but just as often, it would be impure, full of dross, leading to weak joints that would later fail spectacularly, earning you curses, or even a beating, instead of a desperately needed coin. There was a constant battle against rust, against wear, against the sheer stubbornness of metal when your tools weren't quite up to the job, each repaired pot a small, begrudging victory against a conspiracy of failing equipment. The acrid smell of hot metal and dubious flux, the rhythmic, often frustrating, clang of hammer on anvil. These were the sounds and smells of a livelihood, but also of a constant grinding struggle against the limitations of your equipment. For those who worked as farriers, the tools were equally vital and equally prone to treachery. Rasps meant to smooth a horse's hoof would grow stubbornly smooth themselves, gliding uselessly over the horn. Hoof knives, essential for paring and shaping, would lose their edge at the crucial moment, threatening to slip and injure either the farrier or the horse, an unforgivable sin if it was a customer's animal. The portable forge, if you even had one, was often a temperamental beast, a coughing, smoking contraption of patched bellows and crumbling clay that was difficult to light in damp weather, and even harder to keep at a consistent heat. Shoeing a nervous or unruly horse, and many were when faced with a stranger reeking of smoke and iron, with substandard tools was an open invitation to injury. A sudden kick from a powerful leg could break bones. A misplaced nail, driven by an unsteady hand using a worn hammer, could lame the animal and destroy your reputation and any chance of payment in an instant. You'd be working in makeshift conditions, often outdoors in the blistering sun or freezing rain, the wind whipping sparks from your forge into your eyes, your back screaming in protest from bending over, your hands raw, calloused, and often burned. The tools felt less like aids and more like active antagonists in these daily dramas. If music was your trade, the fiddle perhaps, its voice both mournful and defiant, or a simple wooden pipe that could coax a melody from the very air. Your instrument was your soul, but also a fragile thing in a world designed to crush delicate things. A beautifully carved violin, passed down from your grandfather, its wood imbued with the songs and sorrows of generations, was a treasure beyond price, a direct link to your heritage. But its delicate strings, often made from unreliable gut, could snap with a disheartening twang in the middle of a performance, turning a moment of potential connection into an awkward, income-losing silence. Its wood could crack in extremes of temperature or humidity, conditions you had no control over. Its voice could be silenced by a clumsy accident in the cramped confines of the Vardo, or, more terrifyingly, by a deliberate act of malice, a local zealot smashing it underfoot as an instrument of the devil, a soldier breaking it over his knee for sport. Imagine the heartbreak of a beautifully played melody, intended to charm a few coins from a reluctant audience or soothe a crying child, being cut short. The ensuing silence filled with derision or outright threat instead of applause. The scent of rosin and old wood, the feel of the smooth, worn neck in your hand. These were profound comforts, yes, but also sources of constant, teeth-grinding anxiety. Each note coaxed from it felt like a small act of defiance against a world that preferred you silent. And for the women who told fortunes, their tools were less tangible, but no less important. A worn deck of cards, perhaps, their images, the enigmatic moon, the stark tower, the hopeful star, faded and softened by countless anxious hands. A few polished stones gathered from a riverbed, cool and smooth to the touch. Or simply their own intuition, a lifetime of observing the flickers of fear and desire in Gage eyes, and a deep understanding of human nature's desperate craving for certainty. But even these could fail. A skeptical audience, armed with reason or religious fervor, could dismantle their pronouncements with scorn. A local priest, seeing his own trade in predicting futures and assuaging fears threatened, might denounce their arts as witchcraft from the pulpit, whipping up a mob. A sudden shift in the crowd's mood, from giggling curiosity to snarling hostility, could turn a session sour in an instant, the air thick with menace instead of mystique. Their protection wasn't in the cards, which could be scattered by a gust of wind or a kick. It was in their quick wits, their ability to read the subtle cues of danger as accurately as they read a palm, and the speed with which they could gather their meager props and melt away, leaving only a lingering scent of unfamiliar herbs and the unsettling memory of their pronouncements. As for actual protective gear, the very concept was a cruel joke. Your clothing, often ragged, patched with mismatched scraps of cloth, and offering little real warmth, was your primary defense against the elements. A sturdy pair of boots was a treasure rarer than a kind word from a bailiff, but more often, footwear was worn out, leaky, or simply a distant memory, your feet calloused and cracked from direct contact with the unforgiving earth. There were no steel-toed boots for the farrier risking a crushed foot, no fire-resistant aprons for the smith enduring the forge's fiery breath, no armored wagons to protect against attack by bandits or vigilantes. Your protection was your vigilance, your speed, your ability to become as insubstantial as smoke, to fade into the landscape. The tools of your trade were for earning a meager, precarious existence, not for defending it. They were extensions of your hands, your skill, your heritage, but they were also constant, tangible reminders of your profound vulnerability in a world that saw those very skills as suspect and that heritage as a crime. You cursed them when they broke, when they slipped, when they flatly refused to do your bidding at a critical juncture. But you also mended them with a grudging, desperate care, coaxing one more day's work, one more mile, one more song out of their stubborn, failing bodies. It was an unholy matrimony, this bond with your tools, forged in shared misery, mutual disrespect, and an utterly stubborn refusal to give in. They were, in the end, as weary, as wandering, and as persistently, frustratingly alive as you were. The relentless road, the biting winds, the constant damp, the gnawing hunger, and the ever-present fear. These things weren't just abstract hardships. They were sculptors, patiently, cruelly chiseling away at the Romani traveler's body and mind, until the very act of living felt like a prolonged, unwinnable siege. By the time a man or woman reached what a settled, comfortable Gadjo might consider their prime, say 30 years of age, their Romani counterpart was often already a walking museum of occupational hazards, a roadmap of miseries etched onto their very flesh, each line a testament to a battle fought and, more often than not, lost against the world. Let's start with the body, that faithful, long-suffering beast of burden, which had an annoying habit of rebelling in the most inconvenient ways. Your spine, for instance, after years spent hunched over a tinker's tools, peering at the tiny, intricate work of mending a pot with solder that refused to flow, or contorted into unnatural positions while shoeing a reluctant, kicking horse with hooves like iron, or simply from the endless, merciless jarring of the Vardo on rutted tracks that felt like they were paved with dragon's teeth, likely resembled less a strong column and more a gnarled, twisted tree branch permanently bent by an unkind wind. Mornings weren't greeted with a refreshing stretch, but with a chorus of creaks, pops, and groans from joints that sang agonized arias of chronic inflammation, a symphony of suffering that no herbal remedy, however hopefully brewed from scavenged weeds, could truly silence. Sleep, when it came on the hard boards of the wagon, was less a respite and more a brief ceasefire, from which you awoke feeling like you'd been beaten with sacks of stones. Your hands, oh, your magnificent ruined hands, the primary tools that stood between your family and starvation. If you were a smith, they were a cartography of burns, old and new, a tapestry of calluses thick as old leather, the knuckles swollen and misshapen, the grip perhaps not as true as it once was, leading to a dropped tool at a critical moment or a poorly struck blow that ruined a piece of work. If you were a woman constantly sewing, carding wool that was stiff with lanolin and dirt, or gripping the reins for hours on end as the wagon lurched and swayed, your fingers would be needle-pricked till they were permanently stippled, chapped raw by the wind until they split and bled into your work, and twisted by early arthritis into shapes that mocked their former dexterity. They were less flesh and blood, more gnarled roots, testaments to a lifetime of making, mending, and desperately holding on. Feet, too, bore the brunt of this relentless existence. Often ill-shod in boots that were themselves cobbled together from scraps or entirely bare, they trudged through sucking mud, biting snow, and over sharp stones that lay in wait like malicious teeth. This led to chronic sores that festered, infections that could travel up your leg, and a peculiar, shuffling, pain-minimizing gait that marked many an old traveler, each step a carefully considered negotiation with agony. Then there was the skin, your body's first line of defense, perpetually under siege and usually losing. Sunburn in summer wasn't a temporary discomfort you'd soothe with aloe. It was a blistering torment that peeled away in painful, unsightly sheets, leaving the underlying skin raw and vulnerable, only to be scorched again the next day under a sky that seemed to offer no mercy, only more heat. In winter, it was the biting cold that cracked your lips till they bled into your meager soup and turned your fingers and toes into aching, numb appendages, sometimes leading to the black creep of frostbite that could steal them altogether, leaving you maimed and even less capable of earning your keep. The constant exposure to wind, rain, and harsh sun aged you prematurely, carving deep lines into your face until a man of 40 might look 60, his eyes peering out from a leather mask of weathered skin, a lifetime of hardship written there for anyone to read, though few ever bothered to look closely. And let's not forget the constant, unwelcome, and maddeningly intimate attention of fleas, lice, and scabies, turning your meager bedding and clothing into instruments of torture, the itching a relentless distraction that could drive a person to the brink of madness, making even the briefest moment of rest a new form of torment. Personal hygiene was a luxury few could afford regularly, when water itself was a precious, hauled commodity often reserved for drinking or cooking, and the resulting skin ailments, rashes, boils, weeping sores, were just another layer of humiliation and discomfort to endure. Your eyes, constantly squinting against the sun's glare reflecting off a dusty track, peering through the stinging haze of wood smoke in poorly ventilated wagons or tents, or straining to do fine, intricate work in the dim, flickering light of a single precious candle or a meager, sputtering fire, would often begin to fail early. The world, once sharp and clear, would slowly blur at the edges, making intricate tasks like threading a needle or spotting the subtle signs of a lame horse more difficult, and reading the subtle signs of danger in a gajo's face a more perilous gamble. And your teeth, with a diet that was often poor, consisting of coarse, abrasive bread and lacking in vital nutrients, and with no access to even the most rudimentary dental care beyond yanking a rotten tooth with a pair of pliers, if you were lucky enough to have them and brave enough to use them. Toothache was a common, insidious, and agonizing affliction. A rotten tooth wasn't just a source of searing, mind-numbing pain that could make eating impossible and sleeping a distant dream. It could lead to debilitating infections, your jaw swelling grotesquely, a slow, miserable decline fueled by pus and fever. You might see an old Romani, his face sunken where teeth used to be, his gums bare and sore, a silent testament to a lifetime of gnawing on hard bread and harder realities. But it wasn't just the spectacular injuries or the slow decay of the outer body that wore you down with such grim efficiency. Oh no. The lifestyle was a prolific distributor of fascinating and debilitating internal afflictions, your insides rebelling as much as your outsides. Dysentery, the bloody flux, was a frequent and unwelcome visitor, especially when water sources were contaminated with the waste of humans and animals alike, as they so often were when you were forced to camp downstream from villages. It would leave you weak, dehydrated, and hollowed out, a miserable, cramping shadow of yourself, the shame of your body's betrayal as acute as the physical pain. Fevers, the ague, likely malaria in marshy regions, or typhus carried by the lice you couldn't get rid of, would strike without warning, leaving you shivering uncontrollably one moment, your teeth chattering like dice in a cup, and burning with an internal fire. The next, your sweat soaking your already damp palate, your mind filled with delirious, terrifying visions. Respiratory problems were rampant. The constant inhalation of wood smoke in poorly ventilated wagons or tents that always seemed to follow you, no matter where you sat. The dampness that settled in your lungs like a cold, wet shroud. The biting cold of winter. All conspired to produce hacking, body-racking coughs that rattled your chest, tasted of blood, and left you breathless and weak. Each cough a painful reminder of your failing body. And let's not forget the joys of chronic malnutrition and dehydration, the constant companions of poverty. Hunger wasn't an occasional guest you could politely ignore. It was a permanent resident in your belly, a dull, omnipresent ache that sharpened into a painful, debilitating cramp when food was particularly scarce. This wasn't just about the discomfort of feeling hungry. It was about the slow starvation of your body's resources, the way your muscles would waste, your hair would dull, your ability to heal from the simplest cut would diminish. It led to a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that sleep, even if you could find it, barely dented. Your immune system, battered by constant stress and underfunded by a poor diet, would struggle to fight off even minor infections, turning a simple cut from a mishandled tool into a festering, angry wound that throbbed with every heartbeat, a common cold into a lingering, debilitating illness that could drag on for weeks. The pervasive exhaustion was a constant fog, dulling your senses, slowing your reactions, making every task a monumental effort, every step a conscious act of will against a body that screamed for rest it would never truly get. While your body was engaged in this constant losing battle against the elements, disease, and its own inevitable decay, your mind was fighting its own silent, brutal war, a siege conducted in the echoing chambers of your own skull. There was the ever-present hum of low-grade fear, a baseline anxiety that thrummed beneath every waking moment, as constant and unnoticed as your own breathing until something, a sudden shout, a uniformed man, the sight of a noose on a gibbet at a crossroads, made it flare into acute terror. Fear of discovery, fear of accusation, for crimes real or, more often, imagined by others, fear of violence from a drunken mob or an overzealous official, fear of hunger for yourself, and, more agonizingly, for your children, fear of your children being taken from you by authorities deeming you unfit, fear of the next edict of expulsion that would send you fleeing into yet another hostile territory. This wasn't the acute fear of a soldier in battle, with its adrenaline and its eventual resolution. It was a chronic, wearing, soul-corroding fear that became as much a part of you as your own shadow, poisoning even moments of potential peace. Every approaching stranger was a potential threat. Every closed door a symbol of rejection. Every official-looking document posted on a village wall a possible death sentence or warrant for your suffering. You learned to read the subtle shifts in a crowd's temper, the way a tavern emptied when you entered, the way children were snatched away from your path, as a wild animal reads the signs of a coming storm. Then there was the sheer, soul-crushing monotony of the struggle, a relentless cycle of movement, marginal survival, and persecution, repeating with the grim predictability of the seasons, only with more misery. One day blurred into the next, one unwelcoming village replaced by another equally unwelcoming one. The brief flickers of hope, a kind word, a successful day's trade, a night undisturbed, inevitably extinguished by the next hardship, the next expulsion, the next act of casual cruelty. This wasn't the exciting freedom of the open road that romantics and balladeers imagined. It was often a grim, repetitive trudge with no real destination in sight. A hamster wheel of suffering powered by your own fading energy. Your inner world likely became a fortress of stoic resignation, its walls built high against the constant barrage of insults and injuries, punctuated by flashes of impotent burning anger, or a bleak, weary cynicism that tasted like ash in your mouth. What was the point of hoping when hope was so consistently brutally betrayed? What was the point of dreaming when dreams only made the waking reality more unbearable? The constant dehumanization, the endless litany of insults hurled at you like stones, thief, vagrant, heathen, child stealer, sorcerer, filth, chipped away at your sense of self, at your very humanity, to be constantly seen not as an individual with thoughts, feelings, and skills, but as a despised stereotype, a walking embodiment of other people's fears and prejudices, to have your very existence criminalized simply because of who you were born as, eroded the spirit. You might develop a hard outer shell, a mask of indifference or even defiant amusement, but beneath it, the wounds would fester, unseen and untreated. The lack of agency, the profound and terrifying feeling that your life was entirely at the mercy of forces beyond your control, the whims of local lords and their petty tyrannies, the ever-changing, ever-harsher laws designed to eradicate you, the blind prejudice of strangers, was a heavy, suffocating burden. You were a leaf in a storm, with no say in where you were blown, only the desperate hope of not being smashed against the rocks. Isolation, paradoxically, could also be a torment, even when surrounded by your own kin, your familia. The need for constant vigilance, the suffocating secrecy that shrouded your customs and your language from hostile eyes, the awareness that any interaction with the Gaje world was fraught with peril, created a sense of being perpetually embattled, cut off from the wider human family, marooned on an island of suspicion. Laughter, when it came, might be harsh and brittle, a momentary release before the defenses went up again, a sound that died quickly in the throat. Trust, even amongst yourselves, could be strained by the desperate pressures of survival, by hunger that made tempers short, by fear that made people suspicious. How did one cope with this avalanche of physical and mental torment? There was no single answer, only a spectrum of human responses to inhuman pressure. Perhaps through a fierce, almost stubborn adherence to tradition, to the songs that spoke of freedom and sorrow, to the stories that reminded you of who you were, of a history that predated the persecution, a lineage that stretched back to a mythical, freer past. These were anchors in a storm-tossed sea. Perhaps through a dark, fatalistic humor, finding a grim absurdity in the relentless misery, a shared, whispered joke about the stupidity of a local bailiff or the outrageousness of an accusation. They blame us for the sour milk and the drought. What? Are we gods now? This laughter, when it came, was less about joy and more about defiance, a refusal to be entirely crushed. Perhaps through small acts of defiance that no one but you would recognize as such, a perfectly mended pot that sang when struck, a horse traded for a surprisingly good price through sheer cunning, a tune played on a battered fiddle with such heartbreaking beauty that it momentarily silenced even the most hostile onlooker. These were tiny, flickering candles of self-worth in an overwhelming darkness. Or perhaps for many, there was no effective coping mechanism. Just a slow, inexorable descent into a weary apathy, a dulling of the spirit until the only goal left was to endure, to put one foot in front of the other, one more day, one more mile, because that was all that was left. The screaming silence within, the unvoiced griefs and unarticulated fears, were often the heaviest burdens of all, carried unseen and unacknowledged on that endless, weary, and profoundly lonely road. The fear for your children, watching them inherit this legacy of suffering, seeing their bright, youthful eyes slowly cloud over with the same weariness that you carried in your own. That was a unique and exquisite torture, a daily crucifixion of the soul. If the sheer physical hardship of the road, the treachery of your own tools, and the rebellion of your aching body weren't enough to grind your spirit into a fine gray powder, there was always the human element, that delightful, ever-surprising grab bag of cruelty, ignorance, petty tyranny, and naked exploitation that the settled world, the world of the Gaji, seemed to offer your people in endless, inventive abundance. Travel, for the Romani, was rarely a solitary affair, a lonely communion with nature. It was a constant, wary negotiation with other humans, and the company you kept, both within your own group and especially without, often amplified the misery exponentially, turning mere survival into a daily gladiatorial contest, where the lions were always hungry and the crowd was always baying for your blood. Let's begin with your esteemed clientele, the Gaje who, despite their profound suspicion and often open, sputtering disgust, occasionally found your skills, your ability to breathe life back into a broken pot with what seemed like alchemical skill, to understand the silent language of a sick horse that their own farriers had given up on, to pluck a lively tune from a battered fiddle that could make even the most leaden feet tap, momentarily useful. These were your employers, if you could apply such a civilized term to transactions so often steeped in contempt and the barely veiled threat of violence. Dealing with them was like navigating a minefield paved with eggshells, blindfolded, with a throbbing hangover from last night's fear, and while simultaneously juggling angry badgers that were also on fire. There was the portly merchant, his face the color of a ripe plum, and perpetually glistening with the sweat of his own importance, screeching about deadlines for mending his caravan's dented cookpots, all while his piggy eyes darted about, cataloging your meager possessions, the worn blankets, the few cherished trinkets, as if expecting you to make off with his very shadow, or perhaps the lint in his already bulging pockets. He'd haggle over every miserable penny with the tenacity of a starving wolf clinging to a frozen bone, then examine your finished work with the suspicious scrutiny of a man convinced he was being swindled by the devil himself, his fat fingers probing the seams, his pronouncements often laced with thinly veiled threats that were as much a part of the bargain as the work itself. It had better hold, Gypsy, or I'll know where to find you, and my men will have your hide for a drum, and your brats will be begging on a different road, he might bellow, conveniently forgetting you were only there because he'd sought you out, his own village smith being too expensive, too drunk, or simply not skilled enough to undo the damage his own carelessness had wrought. The implied violence, the casual dehumanization, was just part of the background noise of commerce when dealing with your kind. Then there were the arrogant agents of some distant noble, perhaps a puffed-up bailiff whose authority was as ill-fitting as his stained doublet, or a sneering steward whose breath reeked of cheap authority, stale beer, and last week's onions. They might demand your services. My lord's favorite hound has a thorn in its paw, Gypsy. See to it, and quickly. And no witchery, mind you, with the expectation of fawning gratitude and near invisibility on your part. They'd watch you work, if they bothered to watch at all, with a mixture of bored contempt and prurient fascination, as if you were some strange, performing animal dredged up from a ditch for their fleeting amusement, occasionally poking at your tools or your person with unwarranted familiarity. Payment, if it came in coin at all, rather than a kick, a curse, or a stale loaf gnawed by rats, was often insultingly short, accompanied by a sanctimonious lecture on your people's inherent laziness, thievery, or general godlessness, often cribbed from the local priest's latest Sunday sermon. Sometimes it was worse, an accusation of shoddy workmanship for a tool that was already on its last legs and held together by rust and hope when you received it, a demand for recompense for some imagined slight if you failed to bow low enough or didn't appear sufficiently grateful for their patronage. Or perhaps most gallingly, it was simply the sadistic pleasure they derived from wielding power, however petty, over someone they considered less than human. Imagine mending a dozen heavy copper pans, the toxic verdigris staining your hands green up to the elbows, your lungs raw from the acrid fumes of the solder, your back screaming in protest from hours bent over a makeshift forge fanned by a child's weary arm, only to be told your work was subpar and you'd be paid half the agreed amount. Be grateful for that, you thieving vagrant. The overseer's eyes would dare you to complain, his hand perhaps resting meaningfully on the pommel of a cudgel that looked like it had tasted Romani blood before. And get your filthy wagon out of this parish by nightfall, or you'll answer to the magistrate. The meticulous scribe, if your path ever crossed such an ink-stained functionary for a rare and usually punitive permit or some other bureaucratic nonsense designed to restrict your movement further, would treat you with a cold, silent judgment. His disapproval was a palpable force as he penned your unfamiliar name, or rather, the name he decided you ought to have, likely misspelling it with deliberate, contemptuous disdain, his quill scratching like claws on slate. Each malformed letter he formed seemed to reinforce your alien status, your lack of legitimate place in his meticulously ordered paper-bound world. The local clergy were often no better, sometimes worse. Where a flicker of common humanity might occasionally be found in a farmer or a merchant, usually when they desperately needed something, the men of God often saw you only as a spiritual threat, a walking embodiment of paganism, witchcraft, or worse, diabolical influence. Their sermons would paint your people as godless heathens, baby stealers, and practitioners of dark arts, stirring up the fears and hatred of their flock until the very sight of your wagons could incite a kind of holy terror or a righteous mob eager to do God's work with stones and fire. They were the ones who often provided the theological justification for the draconian laws and brutal persecutions, ensuring that the fear of your people was not just social, but sanctioned by the Almighty. And did anyone ever say, "Well done, Romani," for not only fixing this impossible kettle with nothing but spit, ingenuity, and a prayer to whatever strange gods you follow, but also for not succumbing to the urge to use my own blunt letter opener to relieve you of your smug, self-righteous expression after the way I've been treated? Unlikely. Gratitude was a foreign currency, rarely offered, and certainly not expected. Your reward for a job well done was usually the continuation of your miserable existence, perhaps with enough food for another day or two, or the privilege of not being immediately horsewhipped out of the parish with your children wailing in terror. Competence was simply expected. a baseline for not being immediately accused of witchcraft or stoned for incompetence, failure, or even perceived failure. A horse that still limped despite your best efforts, a fortune that wasn't to their liking, especially if it hinted at their own impending doom, however accurately, a pot that leaked again after being used to boil rocks by an idiot, was punished with swift and often disproportionate severity. You weren't seen as a skilled craftsman, a healer of animals with generations of accumulated knowledge, or a weaver of enchanting music that could stir the soul. You were a renewable resource when needed, an expendable tool to be used and discarded, and most reliably, a convenient scapegoat when things went wrong in the gadget world. The irony was a bitter pill you swallowed daily. You mended their tools while yours fell apart. You predicted their futures, while yours was a terrifying blank. You entertained their bored families with songs of longing they couldn't comprehend, even healed their precious animals with traditional knowledge that their own leeches and barber surgeons often lacked. Yet you remained forever outside the circle of their humanity, your skills a commodity to be exploited, not a bridge to understanding or acceptance. They wanted your magic, your craft, but not your person, not your people. The sheer, unadulterated gall of it could be breathtaking, leaving you speechless with a rage you dared not show. A farmer, his own crops failing, due to his own lazy incompetence or a bad year that affected everyone, might glare at your passing wagon, making the sign against the evil eye, as if your very presence had blighted his fields and soured his cow's milk. His wife, whose child was sick with a fever her fervent prayers and dubious local remedies hadn't cured, might scream that you had cast an evil eye or slipped a hex into the water, conveniently forgetting she'd secretly sought out your grandmother for a poultice or a calming chant the week before when the village healer had pronounced the child beyond hope. Rumor, that invisible poisonous weed, was your constant, unwelcome companion, twisting your every action into something sinister. Stories of Romani stealing children, when it was often your own children who were at risk of being stolen by the authorities for their own good and Christian upbringing. Of poisoning wells, of consorting with demons in moonlit forest clearings, of having the king of Egypt's secret mark burned onto your palm. These fantastic, terrifying tales preceded you like a miasma, a wave of fear and hatred that crashed over you before you even opened your mouth to bargain or beg. You were constantly wrestling with phantoms, with deeply ingrained prejudices that no amount of honest labor, quiet dignity, or even obsequious deference could dispel. Your children learned this early. Their innocent attempts to play with village children often met with stones, curses, and parroted accusations learned at their parents' knees. "Go away, gypsy devil, my ma says you'll eat me." The lesson was bitter but swift. The world of the Gaje was not their friend. They learned to keep their eyes down, their voices soft, and their sorrows hidden. The performance became second nature. You learned to wear a mask, sometimes of humble servility, sometimes of enigmatic mystique, if you were telling fortunes. The spirits are unclear today, good master. Perhaps a little more silver will illuminate their intentions. Sometimes of feigned ignorance when questioned too closely about your origins or your destination. The constant vigilance, the mental energy expended on reading every gajo, assessing their potential for threat or exploitation, was utterly exhausting. You became a connoisseur of subtle cues, the narrowing of eyes, the tightening of a jaw, the way a hand strayed towards a weapon or a purse. Sometimes a very small, very bitter victory might be won. A pompous official outsmarted with a cleverly worded, ambiguous answer that left him sputtering, but without grounds for arrest. A merchant so impressed by a piece of metalwork, despite himself, that he paid a fair price before his greed could reassert itself. These were rare, fleeting moments, hoarded like precious embers, but they did little to offset the daily grind of contempt. The greater victory, the true badassery, was simply in surviving, in keeping your children fed, your culture alive, your wagons rolling, your songs unsilenced in the face of a world that actively conspired to crush you. Now what about your companions in this great, itinerant misery, your fellow Rome? Surely here within the painted wagons and flickering campfires, amidst the familiar scent of wood smoke and horses, and the comforting cadence of your own language, was a bastion of comfort, understanding, and unshakable solidarity? Yes, and no. It was, like everything else in your life, perilously complicated. Misery, as they say, loves company, but it can also breed contempt, suspicion, and a desperate, sharp-edged competition for scarce resources, when those resources meant the difference between eating and starving, between freezing and having a fire. Within the Campania, the band of families traveling together, linked by blood, marriage, and the invisible chains of a shared, despised destiny, there was often a deep, unspoken camaraderie, forged in the fires of shared suffering and a fiercely protected common culture. This was your whole world, your only true nation, its borders defined by the last wagon in line. Laughter, when it occurred, was a precious, explosive thing, often a harsh, barking sound, dark with irony and fatalism, shared over a meager meal of foraged stew or after a particularly audacious near miss with some local caricature of puffed-up authority. Did you see his face when the horse sneezed on his polished boots? Worth starving for, almost. There were acts of profound, almost unconscious solidarity. The sharing of the last crust of bread with a neighbor whose children were crying from hunger, a silent offering that needed no words. The men standing shoulder to shoulder, armed with nothing but tent poles, heavy sticks, and a terrifying unified glare against a hostile group of villagers intent on violence. The pooling of what little resources existed, a handful of flour here, a bit of mending thread there, to help a family whose wagon had finally collapsed into a pile of kindling, or whose last, vital horse had died on its feet. Unspoken rules and hierarchies, often based on age, the wisdom of experience, the strength of a particular family line, or specific respected skills like healing or intricate metalwork, helped maintain a semblance of order in an otherwise chaotic existence. An old grandmother, Furidai, her face a roadmap of every bad road and bitter winter in Christendom, her eyes still sharp and missing nothing, her memory a library of unwritten law and lore, might be the ultimate authority. Her pronouncements, often delivered in a low, raspy voice that brooked no argument, unquestioned. Her wisdom was a vital repository of survival tactics, healing remedies, genealogies, and the intricate unwritten laws of your people, who could marry whom, how disputes were to be settled, which signs foretold good or bad fortune on the road ahead. But constant privation, the gnawing fear that lived in your gut like a cold, coiled snake, and the relentless pressure from the hostile outside world could also turn men inward, or against each other with the ferocity of cornered, starving animals. If one family was perceived as drawing too much negative attention through recklessness, blatant thievery, as opposed to the discreet, necessary kind, or perceived laziness, or not pulling their weight in the communal effort of survival, tensions could flare with frightening speed. A stolen chicken from a Gadget farm by one reckless, hungry individual, if discovered, could bring down the wrath of an entire village upon the entire group, resulting in beatings, confiscations of precious horses and tools, and immediate, brutal expulsion into the wilderness, often in the dead of winter. Disputes over scarce grazing rights for the precious horses. Your nag is eating the grass my mare needs. The division of meager earnings from a day's collective trade. You held back 2 coins from that merchant, I saw you? Or perceived slights and insults, magnified by hunger, exhaustion, and frayed nerves, could simmer like a banked fire, and then erupt into bitter, sometimes violent confrontations, fracturing the fragile unity of the group. There was an unspoken pecking order, and those at the bottom, the weakest, the newest to the Campania, or those who had lost their primary earners, might feel the pinch of deprivation and injustice more acutely, even from their own. acts of betrayal, though perhaps rare and universally condemned by your unwritten code of Romanipe, were not entirely unheard of. An individual pushed to the absolute limit of endurance, currying favor with authorities by informing on others to save their own skin or their children's. A desperate, soul-destroying act born of unbearable pressure that would forever mark them as an outcast among outcasts. Mostly, though, it was a collective endurance. A huddle of shivering, stubborn sheep in a perpetual storm, bound by a shared language the Gadje couldn't understand, and feared for that very reason, by songs that spoke of their joys too fleeting and sorrows too deep for outsiders to grasp, by traditions that were a defiant assertion of identity in a world that sought to systematically erase it. This fragile, fraught community, with all its internal squabbles, jealousies, and unspoken resentments, was often the only shield they had, however imperfect, against the crushing hostility of the world beyond their campfires. It was a bond of shared otherness, a weary, wary alliance against the rest of humanity, a circle drawn in the dust around a dying fire, holding back the darkness and the wolves, both animal and human, for one more night. The constant performance demanded by the outside world could be dropped, at least partially, here. You could speak your own language without fear of it being misunderstood as a curse, share jokes that only made sense to those who lived your life, and grieve your losses openly among those who understood their weight. This internal world, flawed as it was sanctuary. Ah, the famed luxuries of the open road, the freedom to dine under the stars, a veritable celestial banquet laid out on a velvet cloth of night, just for your delectation. To sleep where you lay your head, cradled by the benevolent, fragrant earth like a babe in its mother's arms, to awaken refreshed by the dew-kissed morn, ready to embrace a new day of unfettered, joyous adventure. Such poetic notions, such charmingly rustic fantasies, were best left to balladeers with suspiciously full bellies and deluded aristocrats playing at being picturesque shepherdesses in their perfumed, manicured estates, well away from any actual sheep droppings. For the Romani traveler in the 15th to 17th century Europe, these so-called luxuries were, in stark, unforgiving, and often stinking reality, a holy trinity of grim sustenance that would make a starving wolf pause and consider its life choices. Questionable shelter that offered more new ailments and infestations than actual protection, and chronically interrupted rest that felt more like a series of failed ambushes by oblivion, from which you awoke more exhausted than when you lay down. Each one was a fresh daily insult to the dignity of the human body and spirit, a constant grinding reminder of your precarious perch on the very lowest splintered rungs of society's ladder, a ladder someone was always trying to kick out from under you. Let's embark on an even more detailed culinary tour of despair, shall we? Because dining is a generous term for the daily scrabble for calories. Dining aboard your average Vardo, or in your makeshift camp, was an experience meticulously designed to make a hardened soldier, one who had weathered sieges and eaten his own boots, weep for his maggot-ridden ship's biscuit, the staple of your diet, the daily bread, if you could even call it that, was often a dense, coarse, and frequently gritty affair. The grit being actual bits of the millstone, or just road dust baked in for extra texture. It might have been baked days ago in the dying ashes of a dwindling fire, because fuel, like kindness, was precious and scarce, or traded for with a song, a bit of mending, and a silent prayer that it wasn't already hosting a vibrant green civilization of mold. It tasted progressively more like compacted sawdust, despair, and regret as the days wore on. Its main function, apart from providing minimal, joyless chewiness that exercised your jaw far more than it nourished your body, was to act as a vehicle for whatever else you could find, a sort of edible, if depressing, trencher, or simply a plug for the screaming void in your stomach. This might be a raw onion, its pungent, eye-watering bite a welcome, if fleeting, shock to the system. A brief distraction from the bread's sheer, soul-crushing monotony. Or if fortune truly smiled, a rare, crooked, and probably toothless grin, a sliver of rank, heavily salted fish, more leather than flesh, its scales still clinging on with stubborn, defiant tenacity that you'd gnaw on for an hour, hoping to absorb some ghostly memory of protein and trying not to think about where it had been sourced. Foraged items were crucial. A desperate daily harvest gleaned from hostile hedgerows and grudging woodlands under the suspicious eyes of landowners. Bitter greens that even the local goats seemed to disdain, identifiable only by your grandmother's encyclopedic and sometimes terrifyingly fallible knowledge. Roots dug from unforgiving, stony soil that tasted mainly of earth, sweat, and futility. And berries that, if you were lucky and your grandmother's lore was accurate that particular day, wouldn't send you into writhing convulsions or a technicolor, brain-boiling date with your ancestors. Sometimes, in the direst of straits, it was stone soup, in its most literal, non-magical, and deeply depressing sense. Boiling questionable bones begged from a butcher if he didn't set his dogs on you for daring to approach his sacred establishment. Or even just water, with a few carefully chosen and hopefully not actively poisonous. Leaves, and perhaps a rusty nail for iron, in the desperate hope of extracting some phantom flavor or nutrient to fool your rebellious stomach. The children might even believe it was a game, until the hunger pains returned with a vengeance. The unhygienic conditions were simply a given, an accepted, unchangeable part of the misery. Food was prepared with unwashed hands. Where would you find clean water, soap, and the leisure for such niceties on a wind-swept moor with a bailiff due any minute? Cooked in pots that were rarely scoured with anything more than sand, a handful of abrasive grass, and a string of muttered curses at the injustice of it all, and stored in sacks that were likely also home to a thriving, multi-generational, and surprisingly well-fed community of weevils, mites, and other tiny, uninvited dinner guests. You'd pick them out if you saw them mostly, or try to convince yourself they were just a different kind of spice. Water, that essential elixir of life, was usually sourced straight from the nearest generous, if bacterially adventurous, stream, stagnant puddle, or moss-lined ditch, often downstream from a village that used it for purposes best left unexplored by the inquisitive mind. It might be cloudy, tasting faintly of mud, decaying leaves, animal waste, the ghosts of last week's laundry, and the collective despair of all who had drunk from it before you. Weak, sour beer, if it could be afforded or traded for, a rare treat, was sometimes a safer bet than the water from a purely biological standpoint, though its main contribution was often a dull, throbbing headache, a further souring of your already bleak disposition, and an urgent need to relieve yourself behind a bush, rather than actual hydration or cheer. This meager fare wasn't designed to delight the palate or nourish the soul. It was calculated, often unconsciously by those who provided it in begrudging charity or exploitative trade, to be just about enough to keep you from inconveniently dying on some parish's doorstep, thereby creating tedious paperwork, unwelcome questions, and burial expenses for the local constable. The gnawing ache of hunger was your constant companion, a dull throb in your belly that occasionally sharpened into a painful, debilitating cramp, making the sight of a Gaji family feasting in a tavern window, the greasy steam of roasted meat fogging the glass, their laughter loud and careless, an exquisite form of psychological torture. Your children learned early to silence their hunger pangs, their small faces often pinched and pale, their eyes large and haunted, a silent reproach to a world that offered them so little and demanded so much. A rare apple, hoarded and shared amongst 3 children, each bite savored with an intensity that bordered on religious, was a feast. And what of your shelter? Your home is where the heart is, or more accurately, home is where the horse last relieved itself, and hopefully not inside this time, unlike last Tuesday. Your sleeping quarters, whether in the cramped, stuffy, and perpetually jolting confines of the Vardo, or under a threadbare, patched tent that looked like it had lost a fight with a pack of angry bears, pitched on stony, uneven, and invariably damp ground, were a masterclass in sustained inventive discomfort. Privacy was a concept as alien and unattainable as a king's pardon, a warm bath, or a sympathetic tax collector. You'd be crammed in, cheek by jowl, with parents, siblings, perhaps an aging grandparent whose nocturnal symphony of rattling coughs, wheezing breaths, mournful groans, and occasional bouts of terrified muttering added another layer to the nightly misery, and always the familiar, cloying, musky scent of too many unwashed bodies, stale fear, and damp wool sharing too little stale, frigid air. Your bed. Often a few square feet of splintered wooden boards in the wagon, cunningly designed to find and assault every bone and pressure point in your body, or a patch of damp, unyielding earth, perhaps sparsely softened by a handful of straw that was already home to a legion of fleas, lice, ticks, and other biting, burrowing abominations that considered you their personal, mobile, all-you-can-eat buffet. Exposure to the elements was not a risk. It was a nightly certainty, a steadfast companion. The chilling night air, carrying the scent of rain, distant latrines, or the wood smoke of a potentially hostile encampment, would seep through the countless cracks and tears in the canvas of the wagon or tent, finding every gap with unerring, malicious accuracy, raising goose flesh on your already shivering skin. Rain, never a gentle pitter-patter on the roof, would drip, then stream, through the pathetic excuse for a roof, forming cold, slimy puddles on your already inadequate bedding, ensuring you woke up shivering, sodden, and with a burgeoning cough. In summer, the heat within the wagon, if the canvas was drawn tight against prying eyes, or the swarms of biting insects, could be suffocating, turning it into a miniature airless oven where sweat pooled, tempers frayed spectacularly, and the smell of unwashed humanity reached truly epic proportions. Outside, mosquitoes and other night-flying pests, drawn by the irresistible aroma of warm blood and misery, feasted upon your exposed flesh with joyous, buzzing abandon, leaving behind itchy welts that would torment you for days. And then there were the larger vermin, the four-legged kind, rats and mice, bold and unwelcome guests, rustling in your meager food stores like tiny, furry thieves, skittering over your sleeping forms with their cold, tiny feet, their presence a constant, unsettling reminder of your precarious hygiene and the fragility of your defenses against a hostile, teeming world. You'd wake not refreshed, but stiff, sore, often with a new constellation of furiously itchy insect bites, a crick in your neck that felt like a hot poker, and feeling like you'd gone 10 rounds with a bad-tempered bear and lost decisively. The idea of a clean, quiet, private space to rest, with a soft bed, no vermin, and a door that locked against the terrors of the night, was a fantastical dream. Something from the stories your grandmother told of a mythical golden past. A paradise lost where Romani kings rode on white horses and slept on silken cushions. Not a feature of your actual, flea-bitten, perpetually uncomfortable, and deeply insecure present. The Vardo, for all its painted charm on the outside, was often a rolling coffin of discomfort on the inside, its every creak and groan a lament for its occupants, a soundtrack to your collective suffering. The children, huddled together for warmth, might whisper stories to each other in the dark, tales of brave Romani heroes and clever tricksters, a small act of defiance against the crushing reality of their surroundings. Finally, let's consider the ultimate luxury, the sweet balm of hurt minds, the restorer of weary bodies, the gentle embrace of uninterrupted sleep. Sleep? What is this sleep you speak of, Raya? Your Romani traveler might ask, with a hollow, humorless laugh that ended in a hacking cough and a suspicious glance over their shoulder. Is it that thing the Gadje do with their eyes closed in their warm, solid houses, behind locked doors, after a full meal, and with no fear of being murdered, robbed, or evicted in their beds? The notion that night was for 8, or even 4, solid hours of peaceful restorative slumber was a charming fairy tale, best told to overfed Gaji children to lull them into a sense of false security and entitlement. if you weren't jolted awake by the agonizing throb of your protesting muscles, a raging toothache flaring into incandescent, mind-shattering life, or the desperate, uncontrollable need to scratch an itch that felt like it was burrowing into your very soul with tiny, red-hot, invisible needles. There were plenty of other diversions, both internal and external, to ensure your nights were as restful as a catechism class conducted by a particularly enthusiastic member of the Spanish Inquisition. Someone, usually one of the men or older boys, always had to stand watch, especially if camped near a village known for its hostility, which was most of them if you were honest, or on a road frequented by less than savory characters, a category which, in your extensive experience, included a significant and depressingly representative portion of humanity, including some of your own distant relations. The snap of a twig, the distant mournful bark of a dog. Was it a bored farm dog, or something more sinister, like the bailiff's hound? The rumble of an approaching cart in the dead of night when no honest folk were abroad. Any of these could signal danger and the need for instant, silent alertness. Every nerve jangling like a broken harp string, your heart hammering against your ribs like a trapped bird seeking escape. This often led to a panicked, middle-of-the-night decampment, bundling sleepy, crying, terrified children, and hastily gathered, precious belongings into the wagon, and fleeing into the cold, unwelcoming darkness, unsure of where you were going, only knowing you couldn't stay where you were, the taste of fear metallic in your mouth. Emergency tasks were a regular and unwelcome feature of your nights, as if the darkness itself bred misfortune and delighted in your suffering. A horse, your most valuable possession, might get sick, its distressed whinnies and labored, rattling breathing demanding immediate attention, a whispered, anxious conference amongst the adults, and the application of hoarded precious remedies, a poultice of herbs, a carefully guarded bottle of something strong, under the flickering, telltale light of a smuggled, heavily shielded lantern. A child might wake with a raging fever, their delirious cries needing to be stifled quickly and gently, lest they attract unwanted notice from nearby cottages or patrols who might interpret it as an excuse for investigation or worse. A sudden, violent storm, whipping out of nowhere with the fury of a summoned demon, might threaten to rip your flimsy tent from its moorings or send a torrent of icy water cascading through the already leaky roof of the Vardo, requiring all hands, young and old, to secure your few precious belongings and bail out the encroaching flood with cupped hands, a battered pot, or anything that might hold water, while the wind howled like a banshee and the thunder cracked like the sky falling in. The physical discomfort itself was a powerful and relentless enemy of sleep, the gnawing hunger in your belly that no amount of wishful thinking or tightening of your belt could appease, the bone-deep chill that settled deep in your joints and refused to leave even when huddled under every scrap of cloth you owned, the relentless, maddening itching from 100 tiny bites, the chorus of coughs, some dry and hacking, some wet and ominous, snores that sounded like distant battles, whimpers from frightened children, and desperate, whispered prayers from your closely packed companions, all conspired to keep true, deep, restorative slumber, a rare and precious commodity, as elusive as a fair-minded magistrate, a warm, dry pair of socks, or a moment's peace. The cumulative effect of this chronic sleep deprivation was a constant, wearying fog that clouded your judgment, shortened your temper to a knife's edge, dulled your reactions when swiftness was essential for survival, and left you perpetually operating at the ragged, frayed edge of exhaustion, your nerves raw and exposed. You moved through your days like a sleepwalker in a nightmare, your body aching, your mind struggling to keep pace with the constant demands of a life that offered no respite, no comfort, no true luxury, only the grim, relentless, grinding necessity of survival. The stars you dined under, if you could even call that gnawing on a burnt crust dining, were often obscured by clouds heavy with unshed rain or the greasy, acrid smoke of your miserable damp fire. And the dew-kissed morn usually just meant another damp, cold, aching start to another day of exquisite, unending, and thoroughly unromanticized hardship. Sometimes, if you were incredibly fortunate, a night might pass with minimal disturbance, You might even snatch 2 or 3 consecutive hours of oblivion. You'd wake feeling almost human until the cold, the hunger, and the memory of where you were and who you were crashed down again. Those rare mornings were almost worse, the brief illusion of rest making the reality even harsher. Now, after hearing about the sumptuous banquets that would make a king jealous, the palatial accommodations rivaling the finest manor houses, and the tranquil, uninterrupted slumber so generously afforded to the Romani traveler on their picturesque journeys, you might be wondering about the financial remuneration for enduring such a consistently lavish lifestyle. Surely, for providing their unique and often indispensable skills, the mending of essential tools that kept farms running, the intuitive care of valuable livestock, the occasional, eerily accurate glimpse into the veiled future, or a song that could momentarily lift the leaden weight of a peasant's dreary existence, they were showered with appreciation, respect, and most importantly, coin, or at least treated to a fair and consistent wage that reflected their expertise. If you believe that particular fairy tale, I have a prime piece of swampland in Bohemia I'd like to sell you, complete with a guaranteed annual unicorn migration and a self-polishing chamber pot. The economic reality for most Romani in the 15th to 17th century Europe was less feast or famine, and more a relentless, soul-crushing, stomach-gnawing famine, occasionally interrupted by crumbs that tasted suspiciously of condescension, and then promptly back to famine, possibly with a beating or a lecture on thrift for asking for more. The concept of a regular payday, involving the satisfying clink of actual silver or gold coins, was, for most Romani, a delightful fiction, something encountered in the more optimistic and fantastical tales they told their children around a sputtering fire, not a feature of their daily, grinding lives. More often, your wages for a hard day's labor, say, re-shoeing a farmer's entire team of bad-tempered oxen while ankle-deep in freezing mud and fresh dung, or painstakingly repairing a noble lady's intricate silver locket that her own clumsy, entitled fingers had broken after a tantrum, arrived in the form of rations if you were lucky. And what magnificent rations they were. A measure of coarse, often weevil-infested grain that would barely make enough gritty bread to feed a small, particularly abstemious child for a single day. Perhaps a couple of wizened, frost-bitten turnips, already sprouting with a kind of desperate, premature optimism. Or if the employer was feeling particularly magnanimous, or perhaps fearful of a gypsy curse, a chunk of rancid salt pork, so hard and briny it could have been used to pave roads or stun a charging boar. This wasn't exactly a king's ransom, nor even a jester's pittance. It was meticulously calculated, with a miser's eagle-eyed precision, to be just about enough to keep you from inconveniently expiring from starvation on their property, thus avoiding the unpleasantness of an inquest, the bother of digging a pauper's grave, or, heaven forbid, a fleeting moment of human guilt. Consistency in this largesse? That was another amusing jest, a concept as alien as a bathtub. One day, a nervous farmer, convinced your grandmother had the evil eye, might offer a decent portion for a job well done. The next, a nearly identical task for his bolder, more skeptical neighbor might yield nothing but a string of curses, a lecture on the sin of idleness while you're wiping sweat from your brow, and a threat to call the constable if you didn't clear off his land immediately, preferably yesterday. And then there were the deductions. Oh, the glorious, inventive, and utterly shameless creativity that could occur when a Gaggio owed a Romani for services rendered. That new horseshoe you put on my prize mare? It looks a bit crooked to my eye. That'll be a deduction for imperfect work, plus the emotional distress caused to my sensitive animal. My wife said your fortune-telling made her anxious and she couldn't sleep. That's a deduction for emotional distress and lost productivity. One of my chickens, the plumpest one naturally, went missing while your filthy thieving wagon was parked within a mile of my property. That's an automatic deduction for presumed theft, and you're lucky I don't take your best horse and your daughter's shiny earrings in just compensation. Laziness, even if you'd worked until your hands bled, your vision blurred, and your back screamed in protest, could be invoked if the employer simply didn't feel like paying the agreed amount. or if he'd had a bad day at the market. Any damage, real or imagined, to their precious property while you were on their land, a blade of grass bent out of shape, a sudden downpour that they decided your presence had provoked, could be laid at your feet. The Romani traveler was, in essence, operating in an economic system where they had all the obligations of a contracted laborer, but none of the rights, none of the protections, and certainly none of the fair compensation. Barter was common, of course, a desperate dance of need versus greed. Your skill in mending a pot that looked like it had been used for target practice by a troop of archers might be exchanged for a clutch of eggs. Check them carefully for cracks, hidden rot, or the suspicious lightness that indicated they were already addled. A song on the fiddle, poured out with all the passion in your weary soul, might earn you a bit of hard, sour cheese. Smell it suspiciously before accepting, and inspect it for nimble-footed inhabitants. A fortune told with all the dramatic flair and carefully chosen ambiguities you could muster might be rewarded with a cast-off garment, likely threadbare, patched beyond recognition, and crawling with more life than its previous owner, but perhaps it had a bit of warmth left in it. Each transaction was a gamble, a delicate high-stakes negotiation where your gnawing hunger and the silent pleading eyes of your children were pitted against their ingrained suspicion, their casual cruelty, and their unshakable belief in their own superiority. Sometimes, through sheer luck or a display of particularly dazzling skill, you might even come out slightly ahead, securing a decent meal for the family, or a genuinely useful item like a slightly less leaky bucket. More often, you walked away with barely enough to justify the effort and the humiliation, the taste of injustice a bitter metallic seasoning on whatever meager fare you'd managed to acquire. The psychological toll of this constant begging, haggling, and being cheated was immense. Each unfair exchange, another small death to your dignity. The grand, cosmic, and deeply unfunny irony of it all was the immense, unbridgeable disconnect between the often vital role your people played in the local economy, or at least in the daily, practical lives of its inhabitants, and your own abject poverty and pathetically low, subhuman social status. You were the tinkers, the mobile mending service, who kept the pots and pans of entire villages from leaking into the fire, allowing people to cook their food, boil their water for washing, or brewing ale, and maintain a semblance of domestic order. You were the farriers who, with an intuitive understanding of horse anatomy that often surpassed that of the local self-proclaimed expert, kept the farmers' horses and oxen shod, sound, and pulling, enabling the plowing of fields and the transport of goods that fed the towns and lined the merchants' purses. You were the horse traders, often possessing an uncanny eye for good horse flesh, and sometimes an equally uncanny ability to make a sway-backed, broken-winded nag look like a destrier fit for a knight, at least for the crucial duration of a sale, a skill born of desperate necessity. Your women told fortunes, offering tantalizing glimpses of hope or dire warnings of caution that, whether truly believed or not, provided a much-needed psychological service and a frisson of excitement in an otherwise monotonous and uncertain world. Your musicians, with their soulful fiddles and lively pipes, brought a rare splash of color, rhythm, and untamed life to dreary village greens, staid country weddings, or dull market fairs, coaxing smiles from careworn faces and coins from reluctant pockets. You were, in many small, unacknowledged, and often resented ways, the grit in the oyster that sometimes, accidentally, produced a pearl for someone else. You were the oil, however begrudgingly applied, that kept some of the creaking, rusty cogs of rural society turning. You transported goods, mended tools, facilitated commerce, and provided services that were often unavailable, too expensive, or simply beneath the dignity of settled craftsmen. And for this pivotal, if often invisible and grudgingly accepted role in their lives, you were rewarded with a social status somewhere between a particularly unpopular breed of rabid stray dog and a patch of cursed barren earth. You moved mountains of other people's wealth, the merchants' silks and spices, the farmer's golden harvest, the noble's finely crafted silver and weaponry. Yet your own pockets, if you even had them and they weren't full of holes, would have contained nothing but lint, a smooth river stone for luck, a stolen button, and perhaps a vast, echoing emptiness where hope and your last meal used to reside. The phrase hauling a kingdom's wealth for crumbs wasn't just a poetic metaphor. It was a literal daily job description, a testament to a system rigged against you from birth. The very concept of wealth in your Romani world often diverged sharply from that of the Gage. While they prized land, they couldn't take with them in coin they hoarded in chests. Your riches were portable, practical, or intangible. A good, strong horse, healthy and swift, was a fortune. A well-made, sturdy Vardo, however battered, was a palace. A set of well-maintained tools passed down through generations, each bearing the mark of your ancestors, was a legacy. Skills. The ability to work metal, to heal animals, to play music that could charm birds from the trees, or tears from a stone, to tell a story that could hold an audience captive, to know the secret paths and the hidden properties of herbs. These were your true treasures. A form of wealth that couldn't easily be confiscated, though many tried. Your lineage, your knowledge of the Romani law and customs, the intricate web of your kinship ties. These were your crown jewels, invisible to the outside world, but profoundly valuable within your own. This often led to bewildered contempt from Gage, who couldn't understand why you wouldn't trade your worthless freedom for the security of serfdom or your primitive ways for their civilized poverty. Your already precarious economic existence, balanced on a knife edge even in the best of times, was further buffeted by the capricious whims of gods, nature, and most dangerously and predictably, rulers. A good environmental event, like a bountiful harvest following a season of gentle rains and cooperative sunshine, might mean a slight uptick in work for a brief time, as farmers had a little extra to trade and needed more tools mended or horses shod for the increased activity. But it rarely translated into significantly better pay or more respect for you. It just meant the Gage were in a marginally better mood while underpaying you, perhaps offering a slightly larger cabbage or a less stale piece of bread with their usual condescension. A bad event. A prolonged drought that shriveled the crops to dust. A series of devastating floods that washed away fields and bridges. A pestilence that decimated livestock like the wrath of an angry god. Meant immediate and unmitigated catastrophe for everyone, but especially for you, the perennial outsider. Suddenly, no one had anything to spare, not even a harsh word if they could avoid your gaze. Foraging became even more desperate as the settled folk, in their own fear, stripped the countryside bare of anything remotely edible. Charity, always a fickle, grudging trickle, dried up completely. And worse, much worse, you were often the first to be blamed for the misfortune, a convenient, easily identifiable scapegoat for nature's fury or God's displeasure. It's the Gypsies. They've brought this curse upon us with their heathen ways and black magic, would be the cry, often fanned by the local priest, and frequently followed by organized violence, lynchings, and immediate brutal expulsion into a landscape already ravaged by disaster. Then there were the grand, ill-conceived ideas of kings and princes, usually involving war or vanity. A new royal project, like the building of a distant, unnecessary palace or the raising of an army for some glorious, ill-fated foreign adventure. This might mean an insatiable hunger for manpower and resources. If you were a skilled smith, you might find yourself unwillingly conscripted, your labor demanded for a pittance that never materialized, or for nothing at all, working under brutal conditions, far from the protection of your family, surrounded by hostile soldiers who viewed you as less than dirt. Wars and civil unrest were a particularly nasty double-edged sword. On one hand, they created a chaotic demand for metalworkers, horse handlers, entertainers for the troops, and other camp followers who thrived on turmoil. On the other, they made travel infinitely more dangerous. With every road infested by suspicious patrols, trigger-happy militias, desperate deserters, and opportunistic bandits. In such times, your neutrality was seen as treason, your mobility as espionage, your foreign tongue as proof of collusion with the enemy, whichever enemy happened to be least popular that week. Fairs and market days, normally a rare chance to earn a few more coins through honest trade, fortune-telling, or lively entertainment, could suddenly become focal points for official crackdowns, with guards specifically tasked with rounding up vagrants, masterless men, and Egyptians, categories your people always conveniently and damnably fell into. Beyond the official economy of trade and barter, there was the constant drain of unofficial taxes and tolls. Crossing a bridge, entering a town, even sometimes just camping on a patch of supposedly common land, might involve paying an arbitrary fee to a thuggish gatekeeper, a corrupt local official, or a self-appointed guardian of the parish boundary, his palm outstretched and his eyes full of menace. This wasn't taxation for services rendered. It was extortion, pure and simple, another way to bleed you dry, another small humiliation to endure for the privilege of merely existing in their space for a short while. And underpinning all of this was the vast, unseen, and entirely unpaid labor that kept your family unit from completely disintegrating. The endless mending of clothes and wagon covers, the foraging for firewood and edible plants, the constant care of children in perilous environments, the hauling of water, the preparation of those miserable meals, the soothing of a sick child through a long, terrifying night. This work, disproportionately falling on the women, was the invisible engine of your survival, generating no income, but without which even the meager earnings from the Gaja world would be meaningless. In this grand, unfair game of economic survival, the Romani traveler was playing with a deck stacked heavily against them from the moment of their birth, with no aces up their ragged sleeve, only the constant, grinding fear of going bust, and the bitter knowledge that even when you won a small concession, you were still ultimately losing. The very notion of finishing something, of reaching a clear and satisfying conclusion to a period of labor, let alone to the journey itself, was a luxury as foreign to the Romani traveler as a warm bath with scented soaps, or a magistrate with a sense of humor. There was no job well done, now take a fortnight's holiday by the seaside. One journey, one grueling season of mending pots that seemed to break as fast as you fixed them, or trading horses that were as unpredictable as the men who sold them, simply bled into the next with the relentless, indifferent flow of a muddy, overflowing river that had no ultimate destination, only an endless meandering. You'd spend weeks, perhaps months, hauling your creaking Vardo and your weary, bone-sore family along rutted tracks that felt like the devil's washboard, through suspicious, hostile villages, and across bleak, windswept moors that offered no comfort, perhaps aiming for a particular fare that might turn out to be a bust, or a region where the local lord hadn't yet issued a fresh imaginative edict for your people to be whipped out of the county. Or worse, you'd arrive, not to a welcoming committee with flowers and songs, but to more suspicion, more haggling that felt like wrestling with demons for your soul, more desperate attempts to earn enough to keep starvation at bay for another week, another day, another hour. And then, almost before the dust of arrival had settled on your ragged clothes, or the last bitter negotiation was concluded with a slammed door or a hurled insult, it was time to think about moving on, to start the whole exhausting, spirit-crushing cycle again. The concept of finishing for the day was a quaint notion when your home was your workplace. Your workplace was the hostile world, and your workday ended only when you collapsed from exhaustion, often to be roused again by some new alarm. And finishing a journey? A milestone, perhaps, marked by a brief, exhausted pause to lick your wounds, bury your dead, and count your meager earnings, if any, but rarely a true terminus. It was more like reaching a comma in an infinitely long, convoluted, and badly written sentence of suffering, a sentence you were condemned to live out, word by weary word. You'd spend what felt like an eternity hauling a cargo of mended tools or traded goods in one direction, say, towards a town where a market was rumored to be welcoming, a rumor invariably started by someone who wouldn't be there when you arrived. Only to arrive, discharge your obligations under a cloud of suspicion, and then immediately begin the anxious, desperate search for new work, new opportunities to be cheated, or simply a safe place to camp before you were inevitably, harshly, told to move on. Your misery, it seemed, flowed in two directions just like the road itself, which always led to more road. This wasn't just a series of unfortunate trips. It was your very existence, tethered to the grand, indifferent rhythms of the natural world and the equally indifferent, often more actively malicious, rhythms of human society. The changing seasons dictated your movements to some extent. A desperate, often futile, seeking of slightly less brutal climes in winter if such a place could be imagined, following the agricultural cycles for fleeting opportunities to trade or find work during planting or harvest, when farmers were too busy or too short-handed to be entirely self-sufficient. But these weren't the joyful seasonal shifts of a settled farmer looking forward to the fruits of his labor, or a townsman anticipating seasonal festivals. For you, each season simply brought a different flavor of drudgery, a new wardrobe of hardships, a fresh set of challenges to your already overstrained ingenuity. Spring meant mud that could swallow a wagon wheel whole, mud that caked your clothes and your children, and a fresh wave of expulsions as local authorities, emerging from their winter hibernation, cleaned up their parishes with a renewed, righteous vigor. Summer brought stifling, suffocating heat, dust that coated everything and made your throat raw, and a greater risk of disease from bad water and spoiled food, though perhaps also more fairs and outdoor gatherings where you might, if your luck was in and the local constable was looking the other way, earn a few coins through music or fortune-telling. Autumn was a frantic race against the dying light and the approaching cold, trying to secure enough provisions, mend enough tools, or trade for enough warm rags to survive the coming winter. A season of dwindling resources, frozen roads, and heightened hostility from settled folk who saw your very presence as another mouth to feed in a time of scarcity. Winter itself was often a period of intense, unimaginable hardship, huddled in your leaky, drafty Vardo, battling relentless cold and gnawing hunger, with opportunities for trade virtually non-existent, and the welcome from settled communities even scarcer than usual, often manifesting as dogs and stones, rather than charity. There was no escape from this relentless cycle, this hamster wheel of torment. You were a cog in its great, unforgiving and utterly impersonal machine, destined to turn and grind until you broke, wore out, or were simply discarded. The road ahead always looked depressingly, terrifyingly much like the road behind. A ribbon of uncertainty, hardship, and fleeting, usually illusory hope, stretching out to a horizon that never got any closer, a horizon that promised only more of the same. The to-do list. Had you bothered to write one down on a piece of scavenged parchment with a burnt stick, would have simply read, suffer, survive, endure, repeat. And then, when you thought you could bear no more, suffer some more, because the world always had fresh torments in reserve. The psychological weight of this endlessness, this knowledge that there was no ultimate destination, no final rest, no reward at the end of the struggle, was perhaps the heaviest burden of all. It hollowed out your hope, leaving a space where only a grim, weary pragmatism could reside. It would be an insult to your ancestors, to the profound, bone-deep weariness they carried in their souls as much as in their aching limbs, to suggest that their lives contained anything approaching what a comfortable, secure gajo might recognize as joy or happiness. Such concepts were alien flora, exotic blooms unlikely to take root in the barren, stony soil of their daily existence. Joy was a warm fire in a snug cottage on a winter's night, a full belly, a child safe in its bed. Things you only glimpsed through the windows of other people's lives. Yet even in the deepest, darkest, most flea-ridden pit of daily misery, the human spirit, that stubborn, infuriatingly resilient weed, can sometimes find the tiniest, most improbable crack of light, a brief, almost imperceptible flicker in the overwhelming darkness. These weren't moments of happiness, mind you. Happiness was a well-fed dog basking in the sun, a concept far removed from your reality. No, these were more like tiny, gasping breaths in an ocean of suffocation, fleeting affirmations of existence that, while not making the suffering any less real or pervasive, perhaps made it, for a heartbeat or two, marginally more bearable, a brief pause in the endless assault. There might be a grim flicker of professional pride, almost invisible to an outsider but intensely felt within, when you, through sheer skill, ingenuity, and dogged perseverance, managed to perfectly mend a hopelessly shattered pot, coaxing the pieces back together with such artistry that the cracks themselves seemed like deliberate, intricate decoration, a testament to your stubborn refusal to let anything be entirely broken, or when you outsmarted a particularly arrogant and bullying merchant in a trade, not through overt trickery that would bring down swift and brutal retribution, but through a subtle play of words, a feigned ignorance that masked a keen intelligence, or an exploitation of his own blinding greed, walking away with a slightly less unfair deal than usual, perhaps an extra handful of flour or a coin that wasn't clipped. This wasn't joy, but it was a small, satisfying sting delivered to the hand that so often beat you, a tiny rebalancing of the perpetually tilted scales of justice. The shared, almost telepathic glance with your son or daughter who witnessed this small triumph, that was a connection deeper than words. Sometimes, a shared joke, so dark it would make a gravedigger wince and question his own life choices, could ripple through the family or the compagnia around a meager fire. A comment on the utter absurdity of an accusation. They said we stole the church bells? What did they think we'd do? Melt them down for earrings that drag on the ground or use them as dinner gongs for our invisible feasts? Could elicit a bark of harsh guttural laughter, a brief convulsive release of the tension that was always coiled tight in your belly. These weren't moments of mirth. They were acknowledgments of a shared ridiculous persecution, a way of saying, look at what we endure, look at the sheer stupidity we face, and yet we still breathe, we still laugh, we still see the idiocy of it all. It was a way of spitting in the eye of despair. Perhaps the closest thing to relief, that fleeting ghost of contentment, came in small, unexpected, and therefore doubly precious reprieves. Finding a truly secluded campsite, hidden from prying eyes by a thick stand of trees, with fresh, clear water nearby, and surprisingly good grazing for the precious horses for a night or two. That was a luxury beyond price, a taste of paradise in a world that mostly offered purgatory. The collective, audible sigh of relief from the group, the slight unclenching of perpetually knotted shoulders, the way the children might even dare to play a little louder, was almost palpable. Or a day when trade was surprisingly, inexplicably good, yielding enough for a truly filling, if still simple meal. Perhaps even a scrawny chicken, acquired through some miracle of barter. Its flavor, enhanced by ravenous hunger and shared amongst so many, tasting finer than any king's banquet. The sight of your children eating their fill for once, their faces momentarily losing that pinched, anxious, old before their time look, their bellies briefly rounded, could spark a faint, warm, almost forgotten glow in the pit of your stomach. A sensation so rare, it was almost shocking, almost painful in its intensity. The satisfaction of teaching a child a complex skill, how to read the temperament of a horse, how to weave a tight basket, how to play a haunting melody on a handmade flute. That, too, was a profound, quiet reward, a way of passing on the torch of your culture, ensuring that something of you, of your people, would survive the endless cycle. Rarely, very rarely, an unexpected act of kindness from a gajo, so out of character with the usual pattern of hostility and contempt that it felt like a minor miracle, or perhaps a cleverly disguised trap. A farmer's wife, her face stern but her eyes betraying a flicker of something softer, quietly slipping you an extra loaf of bread or a worn but clean blanket for a sick child, her eyes averted as if ashamed of her own charity. A child, innocent and uncorrupted by adult prejudice, offering you a wildflower with a shy smile before being snatched away by a horrified parent. These moments were unsettling, disorienting, like finding a single perfect pearl in a bucket of rotting oysters, or a solitary star in a sky perpetually choked with storm clouds. They didn't change the overall narrative of persecution. They didn't lessen the weight of the endless journey. But they might, for a fleeting, confusing instant, remind you that humanity, in its most basic, unadorned form, wasn't entirely monstrous, even if its organized societal form usually was. It was a dangerous thought, that flicker of hope, because it made the return to the norm even more jarring. The knowledge that any such reprieve was temporary, that the cycle of hardship would inevitably swing back with renewed force, was a constant shadow even in these brief moments of light. These weren't moments of happiness that illuminated the darkness. They were more like the faint, distant stars you might glimpse on a rare, clear night through a break in the storm clouds. Beautiful, perhaps, in their isolation, but too far away, too cold, to offer any real warmth or lasting guidance, serving only to emphasize the vastness and indifference of the surrounding black. They were the tiny, gasping breaths in an ocean of suffocation, fleeting reminders that even in a life defined by the endless, grinding, and seemingly pointless cycle of hardship, the spark of humanity, however battered, besieged, and starved of oxygen, stubbornly, inexplicably, refused to be entirely extinguished. It was, perhaps, the cruelest jest of all, to be given just enough hope to feel its loss more keenly. Okay, let's add more depth and texture to the poignant and grim realities of Section 10, Passing the Torch, or The Misery. No one, not even a Romani traveler seemingly forged from iron grit and a stubborn defiance that spat in the eye of Providence, endures the relentless grinding assault of the road and its attendant miseries forever. The years, like relentless, meticulous creditors, always collect their due, measured out not in coin, but in failing eyesight that mistook a friend for a foe, joints that screamed with every lurch of the wagon, a cough that stole your breath, and a spirit worn as thin and transparent as an old, much-mended blanket. This section is about that inevitable, unwelcome decline, the grim tradition of this life, this accumulation of hardships being passed down like an inherited, incurable disease, and the poignant, often brutal moment when the torch, or more accurately, the heavy, thankless, crushing burden of survival, is handed to the next generation, ensuring the great grinding cycle of suffering continues uninterrupted, a bleak echo across time. You didn't exactly choose this life, this endless, weary dance with hunger, hostility, and hardship. It chose you, claiming you from the cradle. And chances are, neither would your son or daughter, given any real, informed say in the matter, choose it over, say, being born a pig in a warm sty with regular meals. Has your own strength, once a seemingly inexhaustible wellspring that could wrestle a stubborn horse to a standstill or hammer out a rhythm on an anvil for 12 hours straight, began its slow, insidious, treacherous wane, as the fire in your belly that had fueled your defiance dwindled to a handful of smoking embers. You'd look at your boy, now lanky and on the cusp of a manhood he wasn't ready for, or your girl, her eyes already holding a deep, sorrowful wisdom far beyond her tender years, and a complex, bitter, undrinkable brew of emotions would churn in your gut like spoiled wine. There was grim necessity, of course, the wolf at the door that never, ever went away. Someone had to learn the skills, how to coax a flame from damp wood in a downpour, how to read the subtle, almost invisible signs of a horse about to go lame or a gadjo about to turn violent, how to spot a hostile official from a mile off by the arrogant set of his shoulders, how to mend a pot so it didn't leak worse than before and earn you a beating instead of a crust. These were not charming folk arts passed down in idyllic, fire-lit scenes. They were the essential, brutal tools of survival in a world that wished you dead. but tangled inextricably with that harsh pragmatism was a wave of profound, suffocating guilt, a cold stone in your chest, knowing you were essentially shackling them, your own flesh and blood, to the same leaking, miserable, storm-tossed barge of a life you'd endured, and your parents before you. You were offering them not a bright future full of promise, but a legacy of aching backs, perpetually empty bellies, hearts calloused by too much loss, and the constant, soul-eroding, weary vigilance that had been your daily bitter bread. The teaching process was rarely gentle or patient. It was as harsh and unforgiving as the life itself, a brutal apprenticeship in the University of Hard Knocks, where the only graduation was death. You'd bark at your son for his clumsiness with the hammer, the way his blows fell unevenly, just as your father, his face a mask of exasperation and fear, had barked at you. The sting of your words perhaps sharper than any physical blow, because they were laced with your own unspoken despair and terror for his future. No, not like that, you useless fool. Do you want us all to starve because you can't drive a nail straight or tell a sound hoof from a rotten one? You'd push your daughter, your little girl who should be playing with dolls, to learn the intricate deceptions of fortune-telling, to read the greed, the fear, and the hidden lusts in a gouge's eyes, to spin tales of false hope or convenient doom, hating yourself for teaching her to trade on superstition and lies, yet knowing her survival, and perhaps the survival of her younger siblings, might depend on her ability to charm a coin from a hostile pocket. And they'd look back at you, your children, with those wide, youthful eyes that should be bright with innocence but were instead clouded with a mixture of fear, perhaps a flicker of bewildered resentment, and the dawning, dreadful, soul-chilling understanding that this was their glorious inheritance, this road, this wagon, this endless flight. There was no proud graduation ceremony, no joyful handing over of well-made tools polished with loving care. It was a slow, reluctant, often resentful transfer of misery, a sentence passed down through blood, an heirloom no one wanted. You might see a flicker of your own youthful fire in them, a spark of defiance or a flash of cleverness, and a part of you, the part that hadn't yet died, would want to fan it, to nurture it. But another, more beaten and realistic part, knew it would likely be extinguished, or at least dampened to a sullen smolder, by the same relentless downpour of hardship and contempt that had soaked you to the bone and chilled your own spirit. Congratulations, son, you might think, the words tasting like ash in your mouth, but never say aloud. You've inherited an aching back before your time, a suspicious nature that will poison any chance of trust, a talent for being in the wrong place at precisely the wrong time, and a future as bleak as a winter sky. Use them well, for they are all I have to give. And while the young were being reluctantly, brutally, inducted into this lifelong sentence, the old were inevitably, inexorably fading, their bodies betraying them piece by painful piece. The road, like a cruel and meticulous moneylender, always collects its debts, principal and exorbitant, crippling interest. That chronic cough you'd carried for years like an unwelcome traveling companion, the one that started as a tickle in your youth and grew into a hacking, chest-rattling affliction that shook your whole frame, now punctuated your every sentence and left you breathless and dizzy after the smallest exertion, a sound that was a constant memento mori to your family. The arthritis that had been a dull, nagging ache in your joints for decades, a souvenir of countless cold, damp nights and days of repetitive toil, now felt like shards of broken glass grinding with every movement, making the simple act of gripping an essential tool, or even a cup of thin soup, an exercise in pure, teeth-clenching, silent agony. Your eyesight, once sharp enough to spot a coin in the dust from 10 paces or read the weather in the clouds, was now clouded and dim, the world a frustrating, blurry, treacherous landscape, where friendly faces and dangerous obstacles alike lost their definition. The younger men, Your own sons, perhaps, or the sons of your traveling companions. Their movements still lithe and strong, would start to outpace you, their strength more reliable, their endurance greater. They might try to be kind, to slow their pace, but the road waited for no one. The overseer's gaze, if you were unfortunate enough to be engaged in some group labor for a pittance, would now pass over you with a new kind of cold, dismissive assessment. Not the grudging respect for a skilled worker, however reviled, but the calculating look of a man evaluating a worn-out, broken-down tool, wondering how much longer it could possibly be of any conceivable use before it needed to be discarded on the scrap heap. The loss of your utility was, in many ways, a loss of your identity, your place within the tightly knit, pragmatic world of the Campagna. There was no pension plan for the Romani traveler, no quiet cottage by a stream to retire to, no grateful society offering solace, warmth, and support in your declining years. That was a Gage dream, for Gage lives. When you could no longer pull your weight, when your hands were too gnarled and trembling to mend a pot or guide a horse, when your eyes were too dim to see the path or the danger it held, when your legs were too weak and unreliable to keep up with the relentless, unforgiving pace of the wagons, you became redundant, a mouth to feed without the hands to earn it, a shadow of your former self. This was the ultimate fear, the unspoken terror that haunted the twilight years of every traveler, becoming a burden on your already overburdened, struggling family. Within the Romani community, elders were traditionally respected for their wisdom, their experience, their knowledge of lore, lineage, and the old ways of survival. But respect, however heartfelt, didn't fill bellies, and in a life lived perpetually on the brink of starvation, where every scrap of food was precious, the economic reality of an unproductive member could be brutal and undeniable. Your family, bound by ties of blood and tradition, would likely do their best, sharing their meager rations, offering what little comfort they could find in a comfortless world. A daughter might save you the choicest, though still pitiful, morsel from the pot. A son might gently guide your faltering steps. But you would see the strain in their eyes, the weariness in their movements, feel the unspoken weight of your presence, and the shame of it would be another lead weight on your already heavy spirit. Some, perhaps those with no close kin left, or whose families were themselves too destitute and broken to carry another, might simply be left behind at a forgotten crossroads, a silent mutual agreement of tragic necessity, watching the wagons disappear over the horizon. Or they might slip away quietly into the woods one cold night, choosing to meet their end alone, a final desperate act of self-sufficiency and a refusal to further burden their loved ones. Others might just fade away in the back of a jolting wagon, their passing as unremarked by the wider world as their entire arduous life had been. The road that had been your cradle, your school, your prison, and your only constant companion became your grave, your final lullaby. The creak of wheels, the sigh of the wind through the threadbare canvas, and the distant, mournful songs of your people. Your only monument was the fleeting, aching memory in the hearts of those who journeyed on without you, already burdened by the immediate, pressing need to keep moving, to keep surviving, to pass the torch of misery and resilience to yet another generation, who would, in their turn, face the same decline, the same grim choices, on the same endless, unforgiving road. The greatest cruelty was that even in death, you were still on the move, your final resting place as temporary and unmarked as all the campsites that had preceded it. So, what becomes of such a people, such a life, tossed on the violent, indifferent waves of history? What is the legacy of the Romani traveler who endured centuries of persecution, poverty, and relentless wandering across a continent that mostly wished them gone, or worse, never existent? No grand monuments were erected in their name, no heroic statues cast in bronze to commemorate their struggles. Their names are not inscribed on triumphal arches or in the gilded annals of kings and conquerors. History, as it is often written by the victors and the settled, has a convenient habit of overlooking the uncomfortable, the marginalized, the people who lived in the fringes and shadows of the grand narrative. Yet to dismiss them as mere footnotes, as a transient aberration, is to miss a crucial, albeit often invisible, thread in the complex tapestry of European history. Think of it: the great lords and ladies, the celebrated artists and thinkers, the powerful bishops and wealthy merchants. They all raised their cathedrals, painted their masterpieces, wrote their philosophies, and built their empires upon a foundation of countless, unrecorded lives. And beneath the shadow of every colossal statue, every soaring church spire, every fortified castle wall, lay the unrecorded sweat, sinew, and skill of countless men and women like our Romani traveler. He wore no crown, commanded no armies, owned no land. His contributions were often small, local, and ephemeral: a mended plow that allowed a farmer to sow his field, a horse expertly shod that carried a knight to battle or a messenger with vital news, a pot made whole again that cooked a family's meal, a song that momentarily lightened a weary heart in a crowded marketplace. He was the unseen ant, laboring tirelessly with his kin to move the crumbs that, collectively, helped build the mountain of someone else's civilization. Without his relentless, monotonous, and often thankless toil, the mending, the trading, the making do, the constant adaptation, the intricate machinery of daily life in countless small communities would have stuttered and stalled more often than the comfortable burghers and landed gentry would ever care to admit. He didn't just pass through their world. He was an unacknowledged, often unwilling participant in its messy, ongoing creation. No statues were raised in his honor, no poems sung of his endurance, except perhaps the ones he sang himself, in his own tongue, around his own dwindling fire. His name, his individual story, has long since dissolved into the dust of forgotten roadsides or the mud of unmarked graves. Yet his legacy, and that of his people, is everywhere, hidden in plain sight if you know where to look. It's in the lilt of certain folk melodies, in the turns of phrase of regional dialects, in the particular way a blacksmith might shape a piece of iron, a skill perhaps learned from a wandering Romani smith generations ago. It's in the resilience of a people who, against all odds, against centuries of systemic persecution, designed to eradicate their culture, their language, their very identity, somehow managed to endure, to adapt, to maintain that invisible thread of connection to their Romanipe. He was the anonymous current, the often unwelcome motive force that subtly shaped the cultures he moved through, even as those cultures sought to expel or obliterate him. He didn't just witness history from the margins, he physically moved it, carrying not just his meager belongings, but also skills, stories, and a unique worldview across borders that were increasingly hostile to his passage. So, the next time you marvel at the enduring wonders of medieval or early modern Europe, its castles, its cathedrals, its art, its music, or even just consider the simple daily life of centuries past, spare a thought for the forgotten Romani traveler. He sought no glory and received none, beyond the grudging admission from a farmer that, yes, the gypsy actually knew a thing or two about horses, or the fleeting, quickly suppressed admiration for a beautifully mended piece of metalwork. Yet, in his unceasing labor, in his stubborn endurance against unimaginable odds, in his fierce, often desperate, clinging to his own culture in the face of relentless pressure to assimilate or disappear, he was more than just a sufferer, more than a mere victim of historical circumstance. He was a fundamental part of the great, unseen, unacknowledged engine that powered civilization, one of the countless anonymous gears that turned beneath the polished surface of recorded history. He wasn't just a drop in the river of time, buffeted by its currents. He was a current, a stubborn, resilient flow that carved its own path, often in the most inhospitable terrain, helping to connect, to sustain, to build, and to endure. His name is forgotten, his individual grave unmarked, but his collective contribution, his sheer, bloody-minded persistence in the face of a world determined to break him, is an eternal, albeit somber, testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. He was the weary wanderer, and his journey, in a sense, continues in the story of all who are marginalized, misunderstood, and yet somehow stubbornly survive.